The sky was silent that morning of 17th of September 1944, but below it, the future of the war in Europe hung on a daring idea. The Allied High Command, led by Bernard Montgomery, believed they had a bold chance to strike a decisive blow. Their aim, to send airborne men across the Netherlands, seize a series of bridges over rivers and canals, and carve a direct path toward the heart of Germany. They called it Operation Market Garden. Its plan had two parts. First came Market, the biggest airborne operation so far, where paratroopers and glider-borne troops of the U.S. 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the British 1st Airborne Division, and the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade would drop behind enemy lines. Their goal, capture bridges at key points, at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem, and smaller crossings like Wegel and Grave, fast enough to block German retreat and open a route north. Once the bridges were in Allied hands, Garden would begin. Ground forces of the British Second Army, spearheaded by XXX Corps, would race up from Belgium along a single road running 62 miles, around 100 kilometers, to reach the farthest bridge at Arnhem, cross the lower Rhine, and push into Germany beyond. Inside the transport planes above the Dutch countryside, the men held their breath. They were young. Many had left home not long ago. The hum of engines, the faint shaking, each minute felt heavy with hope and fear. They trusted the plan. They trusted that once on the ground, speed, surprise, and courage would outmatch whatever lay below. It was not arrogance. It was war. The backdrop was grim, the stakes enormous, but the men believed they could make a difference. If they succeeded, the Allies might cross the Rhine, outflank Germany's defenses, and maybe bring the war in Europe to an end before Christmas. As the first jumpers stood ready, doors opened, wind roared, a turning point seemed near. Yet no one could know then how far off target some drops would land, how quickly confusion and danger would creep in. The plan was high, the skies offered promise, but the ground below held uncertainty, a hush of hope, and a silent question. Could this gamble, this leap from above, change the course of war? It began with a decision made high above the fields of the Netherlands, one that would shape the fate of many young soldiers. For the assault on Operation Market Garden, the landing zones meant for the men of 1st British Airborne Division near Arnhem were not near the target bridge. The drop zones lay some 8 to 11 kilometers, about 5 to 7 miles, away from the objective. The reasons behind this weren't simple. On one hand, commanders feared heavy anti-aircraft fire over Arnhem and its strategic points. On the other, there were few suitable clear grounds close enough to allow safe landing, especially for gliders carrying heavier equipment. The landing fields near Wolfhuis seemed, from the air planners' maps, safer for airborne insertion. Yet in war, distance eats up time. Time, as the planners knew, was the thin thread that tied surprise to success. That extra walk from drop zone to bridge would cost precious hours. When the first wave landed on 17th of September 1944, only a fraction of the men were already assembled. Many more were supposed to follow in subsequent days. Because there were not enough aircraft to bring everyone in one go, the drop-ins were spread over 3 days. That spreading diluted their strength. The initial troops had to hold landing grounds. Others marched toward the target while the enemy had time to stir, to regroup. The sense of surprise eroded even before the Germans realized what was happening. For the men riding those gliders and parachutes, it meant uncertainty soon turned to danger. What might have been a swift capture of a bridge became a weary march across unfamiliar fields, through towns under suspicion, under the constant threat that every noise, every shadow could be an enemy. The plan had high hopes, but even before boots hit the ground, the odds were quietly turning. At 13:30 on 17th of September 1944, the first wave of paratroopers from the 1st British Airborne Division descended over Dutch heathland between Heelsum and Wolfhuis, west of Arnhem. But the drop zones, chosen for the relative safety of open ground, Bar and the Thorn, Dinia, Dullendam, were far from the target bridge. The distance meant that only a fragment of the division could reach the bridge that first day. Because aircraft and gliders were limited in number, the Allies had to spread the insertion over several flights. That fragmentation fractured the unity the plan depended on. Some men landed isolated, alone in fields, woods, or among strangers. Some gliders crashed. Others dropped their supply containers far from the landing zones. In several cases, the weapons, ammunition, or radios they expected to rely on never arrived. As small groups gathered, often under fire, they shifted from the idea of a coordinated push to a desperate scramble. The march toward Arnhem became a slow, dangerous odyssey across unfamiliar terrain. By the time they neared the city, many were already exhausted, short of supplies, and anxious about whether the rest of their comrades even survived the drop. The dream of a swift, clean strike had begun to blur. What was supposed to be a concentrated force became a scattered array of fighters, each trying to find his squad, each hoping the others would show up. In that confusion lay the seed of defeat. The day the paratroopers landed, the men thought they carried the advantage, surprise, momentum, a bold plan. What they did not know, pieces of Germany's armored might had quietly gathered nearby. Units from 2 SS Panzer Corps, including elements of 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, had been sent to the area to rest and refit after the brutal retreat from Normandy. By 17th of September 1944, those divisions weren't at full fighting strength. Still, even in their weakened state, they were enough to shatter expectations. The planners of the operation had assumed German defenses in that zone would be scattered, disorganized, or depleted. Instead, they found men, tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery, a force bracing itself. As airborne troops staggered down onto heathland near Wolfhez and Hilsum, what awaited them was not silence. Across fields and villages, German patrols, anti-tank guns, recon units began to stir. What had been planned as a swift capture turned into a fight for survival. Supply gliders crashed under fire. Some men landed arms empty or ammunition empty. In the first hours, advance units of British airborne forces, under perhaps their bravest officers, tried to push toward the bridge in Arnhem. A handful did reach the northern ramp of the bridge. They dug in, holding breath, hoping help would come. But around them the defenses hardened. German units, even those under strength, counterattacked. Artillery boomed. Tanks lurked across open fields. Every hour that passed without reinforcements tilted the balance. The gap between plan and reality widened, and the men on the ground felt it in every shaking door, every crack of gunfire, every desperate scramble for cover. In that chaos, the gamble lost much of its promise. Fast, clean victory slipped away. What remained was fear, confusion, and the dawning dread that this fight might not end the way they had believed. Night was falling on 17th of September 1944 when a small group from 2nd Parachute Battalion stepped off the muddy road, edging toward the swollen Rhine at Arnhem. They weren't many, about 740 of 750 men altogether, part of the larger 1st Airborne Division, but among them was the raw hope that this leap from the sky might change everything. They made their way through woods and fields, under dim stars, slipping along what locals called the Lion Route. It took hours, far longer than planners had imagined. The drop zones, the stretched supply lines, the scattered landings, all combined against them. Yet by the evening, this handful reached the northern ramp of the main road bridge over the lower Rhine. The bridge was still intact, a silent artery under German control. But for a few hours, it was theirs. For a moment, hope surfaced. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division, other battalions, glider-borne troops, supply units were supposed to pour in behind them. The plan counted on speed. Secure the bridge, hold it until armored columns of XXX Corps could thunder up from Belgium. But the rest never arrived in time. The 1st and 3rd Battalions trying to reach the bridge got stopped cold by fierce German opposition. The ground forces, hindered by terrain and delays elsewhere, crawled north too slowly. Radio silence, lost supplies, diverging drop zones, all added to the chaos. As dusk faded into a grim, cold night, the 2nd Battalion clung to their foothold. They occupied houses on the northern end of the bridge, bracing for what was coming. They were lonely, outnumbered, a handful standing against a storm they could barely see forming. They had won a piece of ground. But the rest of the mission, the capture of surrounding positions, the safe link-up, the opening of a corridor to Germany, that part had already begun to slip away. Rain, cloud, gray skies, and thick woods around Arnhem didn't just hide the enemy. They swallowed hopes of help. Soon after landing, troops of 1st Airborne Division discovered that their radios barely worked. The standard wireless sets had a theoretical range of about 5 kilometers. In practice, under Arnhem's terrain and foliage, many would not even pick up a call from a few hundred meters away. Worse still, some radios were set to frequencies overlapping with German or British public broadcasts. One historian notes these problems had been warned about months before the operation. Without reliable communication, the chain of command frayed instantly. Commands from headquarters rarely reached frontline units. Paratroopers couldn't call for reinforcements. Supply drops, which might have saved starving, besieged men, went astray. Aircraft carrying extra ammunition, food, radios, sometimes gliders full of troops, dropped their loads far from where anyone needed them. Those supplies that did land correctly often arrived too late or under fire. Clouds, fog, and enemy anti-aircraft fire disrupted almost every attempt to resupply. Gliders that were supposed to land behind friendly lines sometimes crash-landed or, under German-controlled zones, were shot down or captured. The plan to keep paratroopers fed, supported, and reinforced unraveled quickly. What followed was isolation. Small pockets of men clung to houses, hedgerows, shell-torn streets, ammunition dwindling, radios silent, no reinforcements, no hope from above. In the darkness, they waited and wondered if anyone knew where they were. In that silence, stranded and out of touch, the fragile threads holding the operation together snapped, leaving courage and desperation in their place. By the night of 19th of September 1944, the streets around Arnhem felt smaller with every hour. The men who had reached the northern end of the bridge, barely a few hundred from Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion, were now boxed in on all sides. German forces, reinforced by elements of 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, tightened their grip street by street. Tanks edged forward through the smoke. Artillery pounded the houses where the paratroopers sheltered. The walls shook. Ceilings fell in. Ammunition that once seemed enough for hours had to stretch across days. Water ran short. Some men fought with bandaged hands, burned faces, or makeshift slings for shattered arms. Frost himself was wounded early in the siege, still directing what he could from the ruins around him. Meanwhile, the rest of 1st Airborne Division, scattered west of the city near Oosterbeek, tried again and again to break through to the bridge. But every attempt collided with dug-in German units, armor, and accurate mortar fire. Casualties mounted. By 20th of September, the airborne perimeter had shrunk into a rough horseshoe along the riverbank, no more than a few kilometers wide. Communications were failing, and the men had no clear sense of how close XXX Corps was, or how far. When German forces finally overran the last buildings at the bridge in the early hours of 20 September, Frost's group could no longer hold. Out of ammunition, surrounded, many wounded, they were captured after nearly 4 days of fighting. Their resistance had been stubborn, almost unbelievable, but it could not change the widening gap between Arnhem and the relief columns struggling up that thin, vulnerable highway. Back in Oosterbeek, the surviving airborne troops dug deeper into gardens, basements, ditches, a shrinking island of men running low on everything. They held on because there was nothing else to do. In those days, you could feel the weight in every quiet moment, the sense that they were still fighting, but the shape of the ending had already begun to settle around them. When the firing finally quieted around Oosterbeek on the night of 25th of September 1944, the silence felt heavier than the days of fighting. The order to withdraw came late, under rain and moonlight, guiding what remained of the 1st Airborne Division down to the riverbank for evacuation across the Rhine. Many walked with wounds that had long stopped bleeding. Others leaned on friends because they could no longer trust their own legs. They had arrived in the Netherlands more than 10,000 strong, fewer than 2,000 overwon. 400 made it back across the river. About 500 had been killed, and more than 6,400 were taken prisoner. Dutch civilians, the families who sheltered them, fed them, hid them, suffered deeply as well. German reprisals, shortages, and the long winter that followed took a toll that no one in the planning rooms in England had imagined. The hope that Market Garden might end the war by Christmas drifted away in those weeks, replaced by a tougher winter and a longer road. For the men captured at Arnhem, days blurred into months behind barbed wire. Many spent the rest of the war in POW camps across Germany and Poland. Some escaped, some didn't. But nearly all carried the memory of those days. The house-to-house fighting, the hunger, the stubborn belief that relief would reach them in time. The ones who made it home carried another weight. They replayed the choices that shaped the mission. The distant drop zones, the broken radios, the misread intelligence, the scattered landings, the thin road that couldn't carry an army fast enough. None of these alone caused the defeat, but together they formed a trap the men had to bear with courage rather than strategy. Still, when survivors spoke years later, many didn't talk first about loss. They talked about the friends who refused to leave them behind, the Dutch families who risked everything, the strange calm that sometimes settled between bombardments. In that mixture of grief and gratitude, the meaning of Arnhem lived on, a reminder of how bravery can shine even when the plan around it falls apart. The failure of Operation Market Garden was not caused by a single mistake. It was the sum of many, each one compounding the others, until the plan collapsed like a fragile bridge under too much weight. Bad intelligence and underestimation of the enemy. From air photo reconnaissance and reports from local resistance, there were warnings that elements of the Suddai SS Panzer Corps were regrouping near Arnhem. Yet senior Allied commanders overruled or ignored them, pressed by hope and desperation. When paratroopers landed on 17 September 1944, lightly armed, they met not scattered defenders, but tanks, self-propelled guns, and fresh battle-ready units. Poor air plan, scattered drops, and distant landing zones. Because transport aircraft were too few, the Allied airborne divisions had to be flown in 3 lifts over several days, rather than in one swift move. Worse, the drop zones chosen for the British 1st Airborne Division were several miles west of the target bridges, especially the critical Arnhem Bridge. That erased their greatest advantage, surprise, and forced exhausted men to march through hostile territory before even beginning to fight. Communication breakdowns and logistic failure. Once on the ground, many units discovered that their radios didn't work over wooded Dutch terrain. Messages went unheard, orders vanished. Supply drops, food, ammunition, reinforcements often landed in empty fields or places already retaken by Germans. Without reliable supply, cohesion and morale crumbled. Slow and hesitant ground advance, Hell's Highway choke point. Behind the airborne troops was XX Corps, supposed to thunder up a narrow road, later nicknamed Hell's Highway, and link up with paratroopers within days. But the advance was slow, cautious, hesitant. Armor halted at dusk. Some armored divisions paused for rest even when resistance was weak. That delay gave the Germans precious hours to organize counterattacks, dig in, and crush the scattered airborne men. Timing, weather and daylight constraints, foggy weather, low clouds and poor visibility disrupted glider landings, blocked resupply flights, and delayed reinforcement lifts. These delays turned what was meant to be a quick, audacious strike into a slow, fragmented slog, the kind of operation the plan was supposed to avoid. Over-optimism and strategic overreach. At its core, Market Garden was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. The hope had been to end the war by Christmas 1944. But that hope led to discounting risks others deemed unacceptable, landing far from objectives, relying on flawed intel, accepting logistical strain. As historian assessments later argued, what began as bravery turned into a tragic defeat. In the end, the defeat of Operation Market Garden was not just the failure of men on the ground. It was the failure of assumptions, intelligence misreads, poor planning, overconfidence, colliding with German strength, terrain, weather, and human limits. What looked like a bold strike became a harsh reminder. Even the best laid plans can collapse when reality refuses to cooperate. In quiet fields and towns across the Netherlands, the ghost of Operation Market Garden still lingers. The bridge over the Lower Rhine, once the prize fought for at Arnhem, stands today as John Frost Bridge, John Frostbrug, renamed in 1977 to honor the men who tried and failed to hold it. Every year, people walk what the Allies once marched, a stretch now marked by a 225-kilometer walking trail, the airborne pad Market Garden. It traces the same route, from Belgium through Eindhoven and Nijmegen to Arnhem, a reminder in each step of what was hoped for, what was fought for, and what was lost. In the corridors of the Airborne Museum, Hartenstein and Oosterbeek, photographs, helmets, letters, and worn-out boots quietly speak of men who jumped from the sky expecting liberation, but found pain, fear, and eventual surrender. For the civilians, Dutch families caught between war and hope, the battle's end did not bring instant peace. Their towns were abandoned or destroyed, homes looted or bombed, and many made to flee. The failure of Market Garden helped usher in the harsh years of the Dutch famine of 1944 to 1945, when food shortage and repression added suffering to loss. And yet, even in defeat, bravery lives on. Veterans, descendants, historians, and local people, Dutch and Allied, continue to remember. They come together not to glorify mistakes, but to honor sacrifice. They teach younger generations that courage does not always bring victory, but sometimes the cost of trying must still be carried in memory. The story of Market Garden remains a mirror of hope, risk, error, and endurance. Its ground may have been lost, but its voices of soldiers, of civilians, of a world longing for peace still echo.